If you enjoy drifting through forgotten corners of history, where the familiar becomes strange and the past reveals itself in unexpected ways, consider joining us for more tales that unravel the threads of time. Tonight, we step into an era when Halloween was not the orderly parade of costumed children collecting candy that we know today, but something far wilder, far stranger, and infinitely more unpredictable. We are traveling back to the 1920s, to a time when October 31st marked the most dangerous, most chaotic, most thrilling night of the entire American year. Picture a world before plastic pumpkin buckets and store-bought costumes, before safety regulations and neighborhood watch programs, before parents walked their children door to door with flashlights and sensible shoes. Picture instead a night when darkness fell like a curtain on civility, when the rules that govern daily life were suspended by some unspoken agreement, when children and teenagers roamed the streets in wild packs, armed not with candy bags, but with bars of soap, sacks of flour, raw eggs still warm from the henhouse, and ambitions that ranged from harmless mischief to acts that would today warrant calls to the authorities. This was Halloween in the Roaring Twenties, and it was glorious, terrifying, sticky, loud, and utterly unforgettable. The sun descends behind skeletal trees, their branches reaching toward a sky that deepens from violet to indigo to the kind of black that swallows sound. In towns across America, from the smallest farming villages to bustling city neighborhoods, a peculiar electricity charges the autumn air. It is not the electricity of modern life, humming through wires and lighting every corner with artificial brightness.
No, this is something older, something primal, the electricity of anticipation mixed with dread, of excitement tempered by the knowledge that before morning comes, something you value will likely be relocated, destroyed, or mysteriously transformed into a symbol of your defeat. You stand at your window, fingers curled around the edge of the curtain, peering out into the gathering darkness. Your yard looks innocent enough in the fading light. The fence stands where it always has, though you have already checked twice that the posts are secure. The flower beds, carefully tended through spring and summer, await their fate with the stoic resignation of soldiers before battle. Your mailbox, freshly painted just last week, gleams at the end of the drive, a beacon of order in a world about to descend into beautiful chaos. You have done what you can. The ladder is hidden in the cellar, the wagon is changed to the barn, the chickens are locked away with extra care, though you know from experience that determined children can pick a lock faster than you can say Mischief Night. Somewhere in the distance, you hear it. A giggle, high and bright, followed by a responding cackle, then silence. The kind of silence that makes your pulse quicken, because you know it means they are planning, plotting, moving through backyards and alleys with the stealth of creatures born to darkness. You glance at the clock. It is barely past sundown, and already it has begun.
This is Halloween in 1923, and you are about to become part of a tradition that stretches back through decades. A tradition of chaos carefully cultivated, of boundaries playfully demolished, of property cheerfully redistributed according to rules that exist nowhere in any law book, but are understood by every child and grudgingly accepted by every adult. The history of this night is not written in official documents or preserved in museum displays. It lives in the memories of those who survived it, in the stories told and retold until they take on the quality of legend, in the faded newspaper articles that document with breathless alarm the annual descent into pandemonium. To understand 1920s Halloween is to understand a moment when America stood between two worlds, clinging to rural traditions even as cities grew and modernity pressed forward, when communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone, which meant both that you could not escape recognition and that forgiveness, eventually, was inevitable. Let us walk together through this strange landscape, through streets where shadows move with purpose and laughter echoes off brick walls, where the smell of wood smoke mingles with the sharper sense of crushed pumpkin and soap scum, where every porch light represents both an invitation and a dare. Let us meet the pranksters who plan their campaigns with military precision, the adults who defend their property with varying degrees of success, the animals who find themselves unwilling participants in nocturnal adventures, and the civic leaders who watch their orderly towns transform for one night into something resembling a very polite riot. Let us discover why this holiday, intended to honor the dead and mark the turning of seasons, became instead America's annual experiment in sanctioned anarchy, and why it took decades of effort to tame it into the relatively peaceful candy distribution system we know today. The night is young, the pranksters are gathering, and somewhere out there, a cabbage is about to fulfill its destiny in ways the farmer who grew it could never have imagined. Welcome to Halloween as it once was, in all its chaotic, sticky, glorious mayhem. The geography of a town matters differently on Halloween night. During daylight hours, Main Street is simply the place where shops cluster, where the bank anchors one corner and the post office holds down another, where mothers walk with shopping baskets and men tip their hats in greeting. The residential streets that branch away like tributaries are lined with modest houses, each with its patch of yard, its porch swing, its carefully tended garden. The farms that ring the town proper are islands of agriculture, connected by dirt roads that turn to mud when it rains and dust when it does not. Everything has its place, its purpose, its ordered existence. But when October 31st arrives and darkness falls, the same geography transforms into a tactical landscape, a game board where every feature becomes significant in new ways. That alley between the hardware store and the dress shop, barely wide enough for two people to pass during the day, becomes a crucial escape route when you need to vanish before the shopkeeper emerges with his broom. The gap in the Henderson's fence, which everyone pretends not to notice, turns into a highway for pranksters moving between yards. The oak tree that provides shade for summer picnics reveals itself to be the perfect observation post for spotting adult patrols. The covered bridge at the edge of town, romantic in daylight, becomes, after dark, a gathering point where plans are finalized and supplies distributed. Small towns suffer particularly from the peculiar intimacy that makes Halloween both more personal and more dangerous. In a city, you can soap a window and disappear into the anonymous crowd. In a town of 500 souls, everyone knows exactly who you are, where you live, and more importantly, where your parents can be found come morning. This should theoretically create accountability, a natural check on behavior. Instead, it creates something more interesting, a web of mutually assured embarrassment. You know that if you push things too far, your mother will hear about it before breakfast. But the victim also knows that if they complain too loudly, they risk being labeled a spoilsport, someone who cannot take a joke, someone who has forgotten that they too were young once and probably did worse. The main street of any town becomes a kind of neutral zone, too exposed for serious mischief, but perfect for the opening acts of the evening. Children parade in their homemade costumes, showing off for neighbors who exclaim over the creativity of a ghost made from flour sacks or a devil fashioned from red long johns and a cardboard tail. Adults stand in doorways, arms crossed, smiling despite themselves, remembering their own youth. The atmosphere is almost festive, almost innocent, but everyone knows this is merely the prelude. The real action will begin later, when the youngest children have been herded home to bed, when the streetlights cast more shadow than illumination, when the teenagers emerge with their carefully hoarded supplies and their elaborate plans. The residential streets are where the true battles will be fought. Every house becomes either a target or a fortress, sometimes both. You learn to read the signs. A dark house might mean the occupants have fled to relatives in the next county, abandoning their property to fate. Or it might mean they are lying in wait, ready to spring an ambush. A brightly lit porch could indicate a family prepared to negotiate with treats, hoping to buy their way out of trouble. Or it could be a trap, the light drawing you in while someone circles around behind. The houses of the elderly and infirm are theoretically off-limits, protected by an unwritten code. The houses of the notoriously grumpy, however, are marked for special attention. If you have spent all year yelling at children to get off your lawn, Halloween is when the lawn gets its revenge. Farms present unique opportunities and challenges. They are far from the watchful eyes of town constables, isolated enough that noise carries differently, spacious enough that a dozen pranksters can operate without tripping over each other. But they also have dogs, lots of dogs, and farmers who sleep lightly with shotguns within reach. The brave souls who venture out to farmhouses are either very clever or very foolish, and sometimes it is difficult to tell which until morning reveals whether they succeeded gloriously or retreated in disgrace. The town square, with its bandstand and benches and carefully maintained flower beds, represents the ultimate prize. To successfully prank the most public space in town is to achieve immortality in local legend. This is where you find the war memorial, the town Christmas tree comes December, the place where civic pride concentrates. To decorate it with toilet paper, which is expensive and therefore rarely wasted on pranks, or to relocate unlikely objects to improbable heights is to make a statement. You were here. You dared. You succeeded. The authorities will investigate with great seriousness, and the culprits, if caught, will be made examples of. But if you escape detection, the story will be told for years, growing more elaborate with each retelling until it becomes part of the town's mythology. Water towers and church steeples and school roofs are the Everest expeditions of Halloween pranking. They require planning, teamwork, equipment, and a healthy disregard for personal safety. Every year, someone attempts the impossible. Every year, the town wakes to find something perched where nothing should be able to perch. A wagon wheel, a scarecrow. Once, memorably, a goat, though how it got there remains one of history's great mysteries. These exploits are simultaneously condemned and admired, proof that the human spirit, especially the young human spirit, cannot be entirely contained by rules and expectations. As the evening progresses, the geography of the town becomes a living map of chaos. You can track the movement of prankster packs by following the trail of disturbances. Soap on the bakery windows means they came down Elm Street. An overturned trash can at the corner of 3rd and Main indicates they turned left. The sound of barking dogs tells you they have entered the Morrison property, unwisely, because the Morrisons have 3 very large, very enthusiastic hounds who consider chasing intruders to be the highlight of their existence. Adults attempting to coordinate defense efforts communicate in urgent whispers, trying to predict where the next strike will fall, but they are always one step behind, reacting to what has already happened, while the pranksters are 3 blocks away planning what comes next. By midnight, the town is transformed. What was orderly is now disheveled. What was predictable has become strange. Objects are in wrong places. Signs have been swapped. Gates hang from single hinges. Yet underneath the apparent chaos is a kind of pattern, the ghost of the community that will reassert itself come morning. Nothing is truly destroyed, merely rearranged. No one is genuinely hurt, merely inconvenienced. The geography of the town remains the same. Only the details have shifted, proof that for one night each year, the ordinary rules can be suspended, and the world will not end. In fact, it will laugh, shake its head, and begin the familiar ritual of putting things back where they belong, already anticipating next October when the map will be redrawn once more. The pranks of 1920s Halloween are not the sanitized tricks of later eras, the fake spider on a string or the whoopee cushion hidden under a chair. These are full commitment productions requiring supplies, strategy, and often several accomplices. They range from the relatively harmless to the genuinely outrageous, united by a creative spirit that transforms everyday objects into instruments of chaos. If you can move it, you can relocate it. If you can tip it, you will tip it. If it belongs to someone who takes themselves too seriously, it becomes priority target number 1. The outhouse, that humble structure that represents both necessity and vulnerability, sits at the apex of the pranking pyramid. To tip an outhouse is not merely to inconvenience someone, it is to make a statement about the temporary nature of dignity, to remind everyone that we are all, in the end, subject to forces beyond our control. The physics are straightforward. The structure is lightweight, designed for function rather than stability. A determined group of 3 or 4 teenagers can lift one side while others push, and gravity does the rest. The sound it makes as it topples, a woody crash followed by the settling of disturbed earth, is uniquely satisfying. The aftermath, however, belongs to the realm of consequences best not examined too closely. Smart homeowners take precautions. They weight down their outhouses with sandbags. They position them against tree trunks or fence posts. They booby-trap the approaches with strategically placed rakes or pans filled with water. The truly paranoid move their families into town for the night, leaving only a note on the outhouse door. Already tipped. Better luck next year. This rarely deters anyone. The challenge becomes not whether to tip it, but how creatively it can be done. Can you tip it and then carry it to a new location? Can you tip an entire row of outhouses in coordinated fashion? Can you tip it gently enough that the occupant, if there is one, has time to exit with some shred of dignity intact? These are the questions that occupy young minds in the weeks leading up to Halloween. Gates and fences occupy the next tier of pranking targets. They are easy to remove, light enough to carry, and infinitely swappable. You take the gate from the Johnson's yard and install it at the Smith's house. The Smith's gate goes to the Williams family. The Williams gate ends up at the church. By morning, no one can find their own property, and a committee must be formed to sort out the redistribution. Occasionally, gates disappear entirely, hidden in barns or buried in haystacks, to be discovered weeks or months later when they have passed from immediate concern into legend. Wagons are irresistible. They are mobile, yes, but not when you move them to places wagons should never go. Rooftops are the classic destination, achieved through a combination of pulleys, ramps, and sheer stubborn determination. The sight of a wagon perched on a barn roof at sunrise, wheels pointing skyward as if ready to drive across the clouds, never fails to draw a crowd. Variations include wagons in trees, wagons blocking doorways, and wagons disassembled and reassembled around objects, trapping them in wooden cages. The effort required is enormous, but the payoff in community astonishment makes it worthwhile. Soap is the artist's medium of Halloween. Every child carries at least one bar, usually Ivory or Lifebuoy, harvested from home washstands with varying degrees of parental knowledge. Windows are the primary canvas. You draw faces, write messages, create abstract designs that will require significant elbow grease to remove. The best soapers develop signature styles. Some favor intricate patterns. Others go for shock value with rude words. The truly talented can create elaborate scenes, entire narratives told in white waxy strokes across storefront glass. Shopkeepers wake to find their windows transformed into galleries, advertising everything from insults to marriage proposals to surprisingly accurate portraits of local dignitaries. Flour and eggs are the heavy artillery, saved for special targets or moments of escalation. A flour bomb, a sock filled with flour and tied shut, explodes on impact into a ghostly cloud that coats everything and everyone nearby. It is impossible to throw one without getting covered yourself, which adds an element of mutually assured destruction that keeps usage somewhat in check. Eggs are more precise, capable of being lobbed great distances with accuracy that improves with practice. A well-thrown egg can arc over a fence, clear a hedge, and splat against a door with a sound like a wet handshake. The smell that develops over the following days serves as a persistent reminder that Halloween has consequences. String and rope enable a whole category of booby trap pranks. Tie string across a path at ankle height and watch as people stumble in the darkness. Attach tin cans to string and drape them across doorways to create alarms. Use rope to tie doors shut, trapping occupants inside until they can find scissors. The most elaborate setups involve multiple strings and pulleys, creating chain reactions where pulling one string causes a bucket to tip, which releases a ball, which rolls down a ramp, which rings a bell, which wakes the dog, which chases the cat, which knocks over the milk, which creates a mess that no one can quite explain come morning. Vegetables, especially cabbages and turnips, serve as both projectiles and sculptural materials. Their abundance in October makes them readily available, and their heft makes them satisfying to throw. But creative pranksters go further, building pyramids of cabbages on porches, lining walkways with turnips, creating vegetable sculptures in town squares. The cabbage is particularly versatile. It rolls when thrown downhill, gaining speed and wreaking havoc. It can be hollowed out and worn as a helmet. It survives impact well enough to be thrown repeatedly. And when the prank is done, it can be returned to the garden or the compost pile, having served its higher purpose.
The relocation of objects is an art form unto itself. Anything not nailed down is considered fair game. Signs are swapped between businesses. The butcher's shingle ends up at the dress shop. The pharmacy's mortar and pestle find themselves advertising the hardware store. Flower pots migrate from yard to yard. Scarecrows go on adventures, appearing in unexpected places wearing unexpected accessories. The town wakes to find its familiar landscape subtly altered. Everything slightly wrong, like a photograph where someone has moved all the furniture 3 inches to the left. And then there are the legendary pranks, the ones that require such coordination and audacity that they pass immediately into folklore. The year someone filled the school bell tower with hay. The night the entire contents of the general store's front window were rearranged to spell an extremely rude word. The Halloween when every chicken in town was dyed green, though no one ever discovered how or why. These are the stories told and retold, embellished with each telling, until it becomes impossible to separate truth from legend. But that is part of the magic. On Halloween, the impossible becomes possible, if only for one night. Candy, as we know it on Halloween, does not truly exist yet in the 1920s. There are no fun-sized bars, no miniature packets of chocolate engineered for maximum distribution, no plastic pumpkin buckets designed to hold 5 pounds of sugar. The treat component of trick-or-treat is still emerging, still finding its form, and what emerges from the doors of 1920s homes is a strange assortment of homemade offerings, fresh produce, and occasionally items that make you question whether the giver understood the assignment. The children who brave the night in hopes of treats do not arrive at doors with cheerful chants and adorable costumes. They arrive in packs, faces obscured by flour sacks with eye holes cut at questionable angles, knocking with a force that suggests the door should open immediately. The homeowner who answers faces a choice: provide something, anything, that might satisfy these creatures, or risk becoming the focus of the evening's more destructive energies. It is protection money, essentially, paid in sugar and starch. Taffy is ubiquitous because it is cheap to make and stretches a long way, literally and figuratively. Every household has a molasses-based recipe, usually involving butter, sugar, and optimism. The taffy is pulled, cut into pieces, wrapped in wax paper, and handed out with pride. What the makers do not mention is that their taffy has the consistency of welding compound and the flavor of sweetened glue. Children accept it with feigned enthusiasm, wait until they are out of sight, and then face the decision of whether to actually eat it or repurpose it as emergency building material. Some taffy survives until Thanksgiving, gradually petrifying in jacket pockets until it reaches a density that defies scissors. Popcorn balls represent an attempt at festivity. Popped corn pressed together with syrup or molasses, formed into spheres of varying size and uniformity, they look cheerful and seasonal. The reality is that they are nearly impossible to eat without losing at least one filling. The best strategy is to lick them slowly over the course of several hours, though this is deeply unsatisfying and leaves your face sticky for days. Many popcorn balls end their lives as ammunition in impromptu food fights or as offerings to livestock who refuse them on principle. Apples appear with alarming frequency, as if the adults have collectively decided that children need fiber more than they need fun. A fresh apple is at least useful. A suspicious apple, soft in places, wrinkled from weeks in storage, bearing marks that suggest it has been sampled by something with teeth, is an insult wrapped in fruit skin. Children accept them because refusal is unwise, then dispose of them in creative ways. Bushes are popular depositories. So are the yards of people who gave you the apples in the first place, completing a circle of passive-aggressive horticulture. The rare, the precious, the legendary chocolate bar appears so infrequently that its emergence from a doorway causes actual excitement. A real candy bar, factory-made, wrapped in paper, containing actual chocolate rather than carob or some other apologetic substitute, is worth its weight in gold. Children memorize which houses distribute chocolate and prioritize them on future Halloween routes. These homes are protected by an invisible shield. No one soaps their windows, no one touches their gates. Some traditions are sacred. Cookies and baked goods occupy a middle ground. A freshly baked cookie, still slightly warm, handed over with a smile, is a treasure.
A cookie that has been sitting uncovered on a shelf for an indeterminate period, gathering flavors from its environment, is less desirable. Children develop a sixth sense for evaluating baked goods. If the cookie looks homemade and the house smells like vanilla, accept with gratitude. If the cookie looks homemade but the house smells like cabbage, proceed with caution. Some cookies are so hard they could be used as poker chips. Others are so soft they disintegrate upon touch, leaving you holding crumbs and regret. Then there are the novelty items, the treats that make you wonder what the giver was thinking. A potato, a raw turnip, a crust of bread with butter, a single walnut still in its shell. These are not treats so much as statements, messages from adults who either lack resources or possess highly developed senses of humor. In rare cases, they are tests. If you can accept a potato with grace and gratitude, you have passed some kind of character evaluation. If you throw the potato back at the house, you have failed, and your reputation suffers accordingly. The truly diabolical givers employ the caramel onion, a Halloween tradition so cruel it borders on psychological warfare. You take an onion and dip it in caramel until it is indistinguishable from a caramel apple. The child who bites into it experiences a journey from anticipation through confusion to betrayal that shapes their worldview for years to come. There is no defense except vigilance and a willingness to let someone else take the first bite. The truly diabolical givers employ the caramel onion, a Halloween tradition so cruel it borders on psychological warfare. You take an onion and dip it in caramel until it is indistinguishable from a caramel apple. The child who bites into it experiences a journey from anticipation through confusion to betrayal that shapes their worldview for years to come. There is no defense except vigilance and a willingness to let someone else take the first bite. Occasionally, homes hand out nuts still in their shells, which are nutritious and boring, or pieces of fudge that are either delicious or vaguely poisonous, depending on the skills of the maker. There is no way to know until you risk a taste. Some fudge is transcendent, the kind of confection that makes you believe in human goodness. Other fudge has the texture of sand and the flavor of mistakes. You learn to read the signs. If the giver seems overly eager for you to try it immediately, suspicion is warranted. By the end of the night, children sort through their halls with the intensity of prospectors panning for gold. The chocolate bars are set aside for immediate consumption. The acceptable cookies form a second tier. The questionable items are evaluated for tradability. The apples are sentenced to bush exile. The taffy is placed in a drawer where it will remain, fossilizing until someone moves houses and discovers it decades later, still sticky despite the passage of time. And the memories of knocking on doors not knowing what would emerge, of the strange lottery that was Halloween treats. Those remain long after the last popcorn ball has been either eaten or repurposed as a paperweight. The costumes of 1920s Halloween are not purchased from stores offering complete ensembles with matching accessories. There are no vampire capes with attached collars, no pre-printed superhero suits, no licensed character masks. Every costume is an act of creation, cobbled together from household items, limited by imagination only to the extent that imagination is limited by what can be found in attics, closets, and rag bags. The result is a strange parade of improvised identities, creatures and characters rendered in bedsheets and flour sacks, held together with safety pins, hope, and occasionally actual twine. The ghost is the universal costume, available to anyone with access to a white sheet and scissors. You drape the sheet over your head, mark where your eyes fall, cut 2 holes of approximately correct size, though rarely in perfectly aligned positions, and you are transformed. The effect is more awkward than frightening. Vision is limited to 2 circular tunnels of sight. Breathing becomes complicated. Walking without tripping requires concentration. But you are a ghost, and that is what matters. Some ambitious ghost makers cut additional holes for arms, though this risks being mistaken for a very pale, very poorly made dress. Others add chains or carry lanterns, accessories that transform the simple ghost into the ghost of Jacob Marley or some other specific spirit, though most people miss the reference.
Witches are popular, especially among girls, because the costume requires only a broom, a hat fashioned from stiff paper or cardboard, and some creativity with facial coloring. Charcoal from the stove provides instant wrinkles and warts. A shawl or dark coat completes the ensemble. The broomstick is both prop and potential weapon, useful for maintaining personal space in crowds. Some witches cackle convincingly. Others simply sweep menacingly at anyone who gets too close. The effect is the same. You are witchy, and everyone understands what you represent, even if the execution is somewhat abstract. Devils are equally common, particularly among boys who appreciate the implicit permission to be mischievous.
A devil requires something red, which can be long underwear, a shirt, or in desperate cases, red paint applied directly to skin, with consequences that will become apparent over the following days when it refuses to wash off entirely. Horns are fashioned from paper, wire, or carved vegetables. A tail can be made from rope, a stocking stuffed with newspaper, or a strip of fabric attached to the back of the pants with alarming insecurity. Pitchforks are sometimes genuine farm tools borrowed without explicit permission, other times constructed from sticks and cardboard, and occasionally forgotten in yards where they will be discovered months later by confused homeowners. Animals are attempted with varying degrees of success. Cat costumes require black clothing if available, ears made from triangles of paper or felt, whiskers drawn with burnt cork or eyeliner stolen from an older sister, and a tail that drags behind you collecting dirt and debris. Dog costumes follow similar principles, but with different ear shapes.
Rabbits need white or gray colors and extremely long ears, which prove structurally challenging and usually end up bent or torn before the evening is half over. The occasional child attempts a mouse, a bear, or something more exotic, though these often result in costumes so abstract that multiple explanations are required throughout the night, each one less convincing than the last. Pirates are ambitious projects. You need a hat, which can be folded from newspaper, an eye patch made from cloth and string, some manner of sword or knife, which is usually wooden or cardboard, and an attitude of lawlessness that most children find easy to channel on Halloween. A vest, a sash, boots if you are fortunate, and the willingness to say "are" in response to most questions complete the transformation. The best pirates add details like drawn-on scars or missing teeth, achieved by temporarily blacking out existing teeth with grease pencil or by simply keeping your mouth closed. Clowns appear occasionally, though they require makeup skills beyond what most households possess. Flour serves as white base. Lipstick, borrowed and unlikely to be returned in usable condition, creates the exaggerated mouth. Charcoal adds eyebrows. The result is usually less professional circus clown and more fever dream apparition, but children lack the self-consciousness to care. A colorful outfit, oversized shoes achieved by wearing adult footwear or simply shuffling, and a red nose made from paper complete the ensemble. The fact that 1920s clowns are somehow more unsettling than their modern counterparts is rarely remarked upon at the time, but becomes apparent when viewing surviving photographs. Occasionally, someone attempts historical or political figures. Abraham Lincoln is recognizable if you are tall and can fashion a stovepipe hat. George Washington requires white hair, achieved through flour or powder, and a general air of dignity difficult to maintain while soaping windows. Local politicians are parodied through exaggerated features and known quirks, though this carries risks if the politician in question is identified and takes offense. The masks available for purchase are limited and frightening in ways that transcend Halloween spookiness. Made from brittle cardboard or stiff paper, painted with industrial chemicals that smell of regret, featuring eye holes that align with no known human face structure, these masks transform wearers into creatures of nightmare. Breathing is restricted. Vision is compromised. The edges cut into your skin. But they are store-bought, which carries prestige, and they are undeniably disturbing, which serves the purpose.
Common designs include generic devils with red faces and black beards, witches with green skin and impossible noses, skulls that are anatomically questionable, and animal faces that seem to represent no specific animal, but rather some platonic ideal of animalness. By evening's end, costumes are in tatters. Ghost sheets are torn from encounters with fences. Witch hats are crushed from being sat upon. Devil tails have detached and been lost to the night. Makeup has smeared into abstract patterns. Masks have been abandoned as the discomfort outweighed the effect. But for a few hours, ordinary children were transformed into creatures of imagination, granted permission to be someone or something else, freed from the constraints of daily identity. The costumes may have been crude, but the transformation was real. And is that not the true magic of Halloween? The ability to step outside yourself and discover that the world looks different from behind a flour sack mask, that boundaries shift when you are dressed as a devil, that even the most homemade costume carries within it a small portion of actual magic? The breakfast table becomes a theater of small negotiations and silent compromises. Your child sits with legs swinging, not quite reaching the floor, spooning cereal with the focus that only children can bring to simple tasks. You watch them eat, mentally calculating how many more breakfasts the current box will provide, whether you can stretch the milk another day by diluting it slightly with water, a trick your own mother used and one you swore you would never employ with your own children. Yet here you are, making the same calculations, the same compromises, trapped in patterns that repeat across generations despite the best intentions. The television provides its constant companionship, a parade of cheerful faces selling products you will never buy, telling stories about families whose problems resolve neatly within 30 minutes. Your child absorbs these narratives without questioning them, learning a version of normalcy that bears little resemblance to the reality they inhabit. You wonder sometimes what impact this will have, whether they will grow up feeling their own life is somehow less legitimate because it does not match the scripted perfection of television families. You want to explain that those stories are not real, that everyone struggles in ways not shown on screen, but you lack the words to articulate this without revealing too much about your own struggles. The morning routine continues with the brush of teeth using a toothbrush that should have been replaced weeks ago, the struggle to comb through hair that tangled during sleep, the search for socks that match or at least come close enough to pass. Your child complains about the clothes you have selected, wanting instead the shirt that is somewhere in the laundry pile awaiting washing. You negotiate, offering alternatives, eventually prevailing through a combination of reason and parental authority, though the victory feels hollow given the trivial nature of the battle. The walk to school takes you past familiar landmarks, each carrying its own associations and memories. The corner where dealers typically stand is empty at this hour, though you know they will appear later, conducting their business with the efficiency of any retail operation. The bodega with its barred windows and suspicious owner who watches every customer as though they are potential thieves. The abandoned lot where neighborhood children play despite the broken glass and questionable debris, creating games from nothing because imagination flourishes even in environments designed to crush it. Other parents are out walking their children as well, a parade of families navigating the same streets with varying degrees of ease. Some parents are dressed for office jobs, carrying briefcases and wearing professional clothing that marks them as people who have managed to cling to middle-class status despite living in this neighborhood. Others are clearly heading to service jobs, wearing uniforms for fast food restaurants or cleaning companies, employment that pays barely enough to survive but not enough to escape. Still others are like you, dressed in whatever was available, their employment status uncertain, their daily schedules flexible in the way that suggests either freedom or lack of structure depending on one's perspective. The school crossing guard knows your child by name, offering a cheerful greeting that your child returns with enthusiasm. You feel grateful for this person who provides a moment of recognition and care, who makes your child feel seen and valued. These small kindnesses matter more than people realize, creating islands of warmth in a sea of indifference. You make a mental note to thank the crossing guard properly someday, perhaps with cookies or a card, gestures you never quite manage to follow through on because the demands of each day consume all available energy. Inside the school gates, children swarm in all directions, their voices creating a cacophony of excitement and chaos. Your child spots friends and runs off after a quick hug, leaving you standing alone among the other parents who are beginning to disperse. You linger for a moment, watching your child disappear into the building, seized by a sudden fear that something will happen, that you will never see them again, that the fragile structure of your life will collapse before you can return for pickup. These fears are irrational, you know, products of anxiety and guilt, but they feel real in the moment, requiring conscious effort to dismiss. The walk home is quieter, the streets less populated now that the morning rush has passed. You move slowly, in no hurry to return to the empty apartment, dreading the hours that stretch ahead with no structure and too much time to think. The cravings that you manage to suppress during the morning routine begin to assert themselves, a physical sensation that starts in your chest and radiates outward, creating restlessness and discomfort that will only intensify as the day progresses. You know where this is heading, can predict with depressing accuracy how the next few hours will unfold, yet you continue walking as though there is some possibility of a different outcome. The apartment greets you with its familiar smell, a combination of stale air, cooking odors, and something indefinable that marks it as home despite its inadequacies. You move through the rooms mechanically, picking up toys and placing them in baskets, carrying dishes to the sink, straightening cushions on the couch, engaged in the domestic rituals that create an illusion of order. The radio plays quietly, a morning talk show discussing topics that seem to emanate from a different universe, problems so divorced from your reality that they might as well be theoretical constructs rather than genuine concerns. The telephone rings, a sound that always triggers anxiety because calls rarely bring good news. You approach it cautiously, checking the caller identification if such technology is available, or simply letting it ring if you cannot face whatever message awaits. Sometimes it is a creditor demanding payment on debts that have long since become unmanageable, employing tactics that range from professional courtesy to outright harassment depending on how many payment deadlines have been missed. Sometimes it is family members checking in with questions that are really assessments, trying to determine whether your situation has deteriorated further, whether intervention is needed, whether they should be worried or merely disappointed. Sometimes the calls are from the school, reporting that your child is sick or has been injured on the playground, requiring you to arrange pickup and care despite having no sick leave from work, no backup plan for childcare emergencies, no margin in your schedule for unexpected crises. These calls fill you with dread, not because you lack concern for your child's well-being, but because each crisis exposes the inadequacy of your resources, the ways in which your inability to provide stable employment and reliable transportation creates cascading problems that mothers with more resources handle as minor inconveniences. On days when there are no immediate crises demanding attention, the hours between school drop-off and pickup stretch interminably. If you have work scheduled, you prepare for that, gathering whatever items are needed, checking bus schedules, or arranging rides, mentally preparing for hours of labor that will leave you exhausted and barely compensated. If there is no work, the day becomes a challenge of filling time without spending money, finding activities that will keep you occupied and distracted from the cravings that intensify in idleness. The public library becomes a refuge on some days, a place where you can sit in air conditioning during summer or warmth during winter, surrounded by books that offer escape into other lives and other times. You browse the shelves randomly, pulling volumes based on covers or titles that catch your eye, reading passages while seated in chairs designed for study and contemplation. The library enforces quiet, creating an atmosphere of calm that contrasts sharply with the chaos of your apartment and neighborhood. Here, you can pretend to be someone else, a person whose life includes leisure time for reading, whose interests extend beyond immediate survival. The librarians come to recognize you, noting your regular presence, occasionally recommending books they think you might enjoy. These interactions are brief and professional, yet they carry a warmth that you rarely experience elsewhere. The library asks nothing of you except basic courtesy, judges you not at all, provides resources freely to anyone who enters, regardless of their circumstances or struggles. It represents a vision of what public institutions could be, serving communities without demanding proof of worthiness, offering knowledge and comfort as rights rather than privileges to be earned. Yet even the library cannot fully distract from the cravings that grow more insistent as the morning becomes afternoon. Your leg bounces unconsciously, your attention drifts from the pages you are attempting to read. Your mind begins to calculate how you might obtain money for a purchase, who you could call, where you might go. The internal debate begins again, the same arguments rehearsed countless times. Your rational mind listing all the reasons to resist, while another part of your consciousness advocates for just one use, just enough to take the edge off. Promises that this time will be different, that you will maintain control. The dealers are not difficult to find, their locations known to anyone who has lived in the neighborhood for any length of time. They operate with a semi-permanence that suggests either corruption or indifference on the part of law enforcement, standing on corners or in doorways, conducting transactions with an efficiency born of repetition.
The relationship between dealer and user is peculiar, simultaneously commercial and parasitic, marked by a false friendliness that masks the fundamental transaction of money for drugs. Your dealer knows your name, asks about your child, extends credit when you are short, all while profiting from your addiction and having no genuine investment in your well-being. The purchase itself is quick, a matter of seconds, money and product exchanged with practiced discretion. You pocket the small plastic bag or vial, already anticipating the relief that is now guaranteed, the tension in your body easing slightly just from knowing that use is imminent. The walk back to your apartment is purposeful, no longer aimless wandering, but movement toward a specific destination and goal. Other pedestrians seem oblivious to your mission, though perhaps some recognize the particular urgency in your stride, the telltale signs of someone who has just scored and is heading home to use. Back in the apartment, the ritual of preparation begins. The pipe must be retrieved from wherever it was hidden, cleaned if necessary, the small rock of crack cocaine positioned carefully. A lighter is needed, the flame applied to the rock while you inhale through the pipe, the vapor harsh in your throat and lungs. The effects are almost immediate, a rush of euphoria and energy that floods your system, making everything seem suddenly manageable, problems shrinking to insignificance, confidence surging. For these few minutes, you are not a struggling single mother drowning in poverty and addiction, but rather someone powerful and capable, someone who has answers rather than questions, someone who is enough. The high is intensely physical, your heart racing, your senses heightened, a feeling of invincibility coursing through your body. You move around the apartment with sudden energy, perhaps cleaning with manic intensity, or talking rapidly to yourself, or simply pacing as your system processes the drug. Ideas and plans flood your mind, solutions to problems that have seemed intractable, visions of how you will change your life starting tomorrow or next week or soon. These plans feel completely achievable in the moment, backed by a confidence that seems unshakable, though experience should have taught you that this confidence is chemically induced and will evaporate as the drug leaves your system. The duration of the high is cruelly brief, 10 or 15 minutes at most before the euphoria begins to fade, replaced by a restless discomfort and an immediate craving for more. This is the trap of crack cocaine, the way it creates an intense desire for repeated use, each high followed quickly by a crash that makes the next use seem necessary just to feel normal again. If you have money for additional purchases, the cycle repeats, each use slightly less satisfying than the last, chasing a high that cannot be recaptured, using not for euphoria, but to avoid the discomfort of being sober. If you have no money for additional purchases, the crash is harder, the come down marked by depression and anxiety and physical exhaustion. Your body aches, your mind races with negative thoughts, the problems you briefly forgot return with added weight. The guilt arrives in force, condemning you for using again, for spending money needed elsewhere, for choosing drugs over your child's needs, for being weak and selfish and everything else you tell yourself in moments of self-recrimination. You might cry, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of your situation, or you might simply stare at nothing, too depleted to even properly despair. The hours following use are lost time, periods when you are neither high enough to feel good nor sober enough to be functional, existing in a liminal state that serves no purpose. If your child were home, this would be when your inadequacy as a parent would be most visible, your inability to engage or care for them properly, your presence more burden than help. The fact that they are at school provides a small mercy, time for you to cycle through the use and crash without witnesses, to pull yourself together before you must present as a responsible adult. The clock becomes your enemy and your salvation, marking the passage of time towards school pickup, creating a deadline by which you must achieve some semblance of normalcy. You force yourself to shower, washing away the sweat and smoke smell, brushing your teeth multiple times to eliminate any chemical taste. You drink water and eat something if possible, trying to stabilize your system. You check your appearance in the mirror, assessing whether you look acceptable enough to appear in public, whether teachers or other parents will notice anything amiss. The walk back to school retraces your morning route, though you are now a different person than you were hours earlier, changed by the cycle of use and crash, carrying additional guilt and shame to add to the burden you already bear. The cravings have subsided temporarily, replaced by exhaustion and a flatness of affect that makes everything seem slightly unreal.
You join the other parents gathering outside the school, positioning yourself apart from the main groups, not quite belonging to any social circle, marked by your isolation even in a crowd. When your child emerges from the building, their face lights up with uncomplicated joy at seeing you, a reaction that simultaneously warms your heart and breaks it. They run toward you with news to share about their day, unaware of your state, trusting that you are present and interested and capable of providing what they need. You listen to their chatter, responding appropriately, playing the role of engaged parent while internally you are struggling to maintain focus, fighting the exhaustion that makes every interaction effortful. The afternoon at home is dedicated to homework and dinner preparation, the routines of family life that continue regardless of your internal state. Your child spreads schoolwork across the kitchen table, requiring help with math problems or spelling words, tasks that should be simple, but that require concentration you are struggling to maintain. You do your best, praising their efforts, helping where you can, hiding the fact that you are barely functioning, that maintaining this facade of normalcy is consuming all your remaining energy. Dinner is improvised from whatever is available, perhaps pasta with jarred sauce, or rice and beans, or sandwiches if you are too tired for actual cooking. Your child eats hungrily, their appetite healthy and normal, while you pick at your own food, your stomach unsettled, your appetite suppressed by the residual effects of the crack cocaine. The television provides background noise, cartoons or sitcoms that your child watches with attention while you stare through the screen, your mind elsewhere, processing the day's events and dreading the evening ahead. Bath time and bedtime follow dinner, the sequence of events so routine that you can navigate them on autopilot. The bathwater runs while you gather pajamas and towels, the temperature tested with your hand to ensure it is neither too hot nor too cold. Your child plays in the water, creating scenarios with plastic toys, their imagination transforming the bathtub into an ocean or a space station, or whatever context their games require. You supervise with half your attention, your responses to their commentary automatic, while your mind drifts to thoughts of the evening stretching ahead once they are asleep. The bedtime story is selected from a small collection of books, tales you have read so many times that you could recite them from memory. Your child snuggles against you as you read, their body warm and trusting, their breathing gradually slowing as sleep approaches. These moments are precious, times when your love for them is uncomplicated by guilt or shame, when you are simply a mother providing comfort to her child. You linger over the story, drawing out this peaceful interlude, reluctant to reach its conclusion and move forward into the more difficult hours of the evening. After your child is asleep, the apartment becomes simultaneously more peaceful and more threatening. The absence of immediate demands on your attention leaves space for the cravings to resurface, for the internal debate to resume about whether you will use again tonight. If you have money and access to more drugs, the temptation is nearly overwhelming, the promise of relief from the discomfort and depression of the come-down almost impossible to resist. If you have no money, you might spend hours trying to find some, searching through pockets and couch cushions, considering who you might call to borrow from, contemplating actions you would normally find unthinkable. The night hours are when the full weight of your situation becomes most apparent, when the distractions of daily routine fall away and you are left alone with your thoughts and your choices. You sit in the dark apartment, smoking cigarettes by the window, watching the street below where life continues despite the hour. Cars pass, their headlights creating moving patterns of light and shadow. People walk by, some alone and some in groups, heading to or from destinations you can only guess at. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wail, the soundtrack of the city at night, emergency and crisis unfolding constantly across the urban landscape. Your thoughts during these hours circle endlessly through the same territory, examining your situation from every angle without ever arriving at solutions. You think about your child and the life you are providing, comparing it to the childhood you wish you could give them, cataloging all the ways you are failing. You think about your own childhood, searching for explanations for how you arrived at this point, wondering if your parents felt similar despair, whether this struggle is generational or specific to your own choices. You think about the future, trying to imagine how things might change, what it would take to achieve stability and recovery, whether such change is even possible given the depth of your addiction and poverty. The television offers escape from these thoughts, late-night programming that requires no mental engagement, channels surfed through aimlessly until something captures your attention enough to provide distraction, old movies, infomercials, talk shows featuring guests discussing problems that seem trivial compared to your own, music videos with their glossy depictions of wealth and beauty and success. You watch with the detachment of exhaustion, the images washing over you without leaving impressions, simply filling time until sleep becomes possible or morning arrives, whichever comes first. Sleep itself is elusive and unsatisfying, a series of brief unconscious periods interrupted by waking, by thoughts that will not quiet, by physical discomfort or anxiety or the sounds of the building and neighborhood. You drift in and out, never fully resting, your body trying to recover from the day's drug use while your mind continues racing. Dreams, when they come, are often disturbing, distorted versions of your waking concerns, scenarios of loss and failure played out in the logic-free theater of the unconscious mind. You wake from these dreams with your heart pounding, momentarily disoriented, taking several seconds to remember where you are and that the dream was not real. The weekends present their own challenges, 48 hours when your child is home constantly, requiring supervision and entertainment, removing your ability to use drugs during the day without their awareness. Some mothers are skilled at compartmentalizing, managing to use while maintaining the facade of normal parenting, employing babysitters or relatives, or simply hiding their use effectively. Others find weekends nearly impossible, the enforced sobriety highlighting how dependent they have become, the hours crawling by as they wait for Monday when the normal routine will resume. Activities that cost little or nothing become weekend staples. The playground, if weather permits, though you must remain alert to the various dangers present even in spaces designed for children. The library for books and air conditioning, your child selecting picture books while you browse magazines or simply sit. The free concerts or festivals that occasionally happen in public spaces, opportunities to be among crowds and activity, to feel part of the community, even if you are merely observing from the edges. Your own relatives, if you maintain contact with them, might provide occasional respite, inviting your child for visits that allow you a few hours of freedom. These invitations come with judgment, explicit or implied, questions about your life and choices that you deflect with practiced vagueness. Family gatherings are ordeals to be endured, events where your failure is evident in comparison to siblings or cousins who have achieved stability, who own homes and hold steady jobs, and whose children participate in activities like soccer leagues and music lessons. You attend when you cannot avoid it, leaving as early as socially acceptable, returning to your apartment with relief despite its inadequacies. The changing seasons mark time's passage in ways that the calendar cannot quite capture. Summer brings heat that makes the unair-conditioned apartment unbearable, temperatures that drive you to parks or libraries or anywhere that offers relief. Your child complains about being hot, and you do what you can with fans and cold water, creating makeshift water play in the bathtub or outside with a hose if your building permits. The long daylight hours mean your child stays awake later, compressing the time you have alone in the evenings, making it more difficult to use drugs without risk of discovery. Autumn brings the return to school routine, new teachers and new challenges, the need for school supplies and clothing as your child has grown over the summer. The mornings become darker, sunrise arriving later, making it harder to wake and begin the day. You notice your child's friends starting activities, joining sports teams or scouts, or after-school programs that require fees you cannot afford and transportation you cannot provide. Your child begins to understand that their life differs from their peers, that other families have resources and opportunities unavailable to them, and you see the beginning of awareness in their eyes, the first questioning of why things are this way. Winter is perhaps the hardest season, the cold making every aspect of life more difficult. Heating bills rise while your ability to pay them does not, leading to apartments that are perpetually cold, to layering clothing and huddling under blankets, to fears of utilities being shut off. Your child gets sick more frequently, colds and flu that spread through school, requiring care and medicine you struggle to afford. The early darkness makes evenings feel longer, more hours to fill, more time for cravings to intensify. The holidays approach with their promise of joy and their reminder of inadequacy, expectations of gifts and celebrations that mock your poverty. Christmas, in particular, becomes a gauntlet of shame and effort. Your child writes letters to Santa Claus, listing desired toys seen in commercials, unaware that Santa's generosity correlates directly with family income. You search thrift stores and toy drives, accepting charity that stings your pride even as you are grateful for it. On Christmas morning, you present the modest haul with enthusiasm, watching your child's face for disappointment or acceptance, hoping the gifts are enough to create a happy memory despite their secondhand nature. The arrival of spring brings relief from winter's harshness, warming temperatures and longer days, nature's annual resurrection offering its metaphor for hope and renewal. You feel stirrings of possibility, thoughts that perhaps this year will be different, that you will find the strength to quit using and rebuild your life. These feelings are sincere in the moment, genuine desires for change, yet they typically fade as the reality of addiction reasserts itself, as the daily struggle continues unchanged despite the changing seasons. Your child grows steadily through all of this, developing from year to year in ways both subtle and dramatic. They learn to read, to ride a bicycle, to navigate social relationships with increasing sophistication. They develop interests and preferences, personality traits that mark them as a unique individual rather than simply your child. You watch this development with pride and sorrow intermingled, proud of who they are becoming, while sorrowful that you cannot provide better circumstances for their growth, that they must develop resilience and coping skills that children should not need. The conversations about your drug use, if they happen at all, are oblique and painful. Your child might ask why you are tired so much, or why they cannot have friends over, or where the money went that was supposed to be for something they needed. You deflect and minimize, offering explanations that are technically true but fundamentally dishonest, protecting them from knowledge they are too young to process, while also protecting yourself from the full weight of their judgment. You tell yourself these lies are kindness, though you know they are also cowardice, your inability to face the truth of what you have become. There are moments of clarity when the full horror of your situation penetrates the denial and rationalization, when you see yourself as others might see you and are devastated by the vision. These moments typically come in the aftermath of some crisis or close call, times when the consequences of your addiction become impossible to ignore. Perhaps your child found your pipe, or you missed an important event, or you woke to discover hours had passed in a blackout of heavy use. In these moments, you swear to change, make promises to yourself and to whatever higher power you believe in, feel absolutely certain that you cannot continue living this way. Yet the addiction is patient and persistent, waiting out these moments of determination, knowing that cravings will return, that the discomfort of withdrawal and the stress of daily life will erode your resolve. Within days or sometimes hours, you find yourself using again, each relapse adding to the weight of failure, reinforcing the belief that you are powerless to change, that this life is simply who you are and who you will always be. The hope that flickered briefly is extinguished, replaced by resignation and the grim determination to simply continue surviving from one day to the next. Tonight, we unwrap a peculiar chapter of American history, one that unfolds in the quiet hours when the world slows down and memory becomes sweeter than any confection. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a time when chocolate was not merely a treat, but a doorway to something altogether more remarkable, when each bite carried with it the promise of energy that seemed to defy the natural limits of the human body, when mothers and fathers handed their children squares of brown sweetness and wondered, hours later, why bedtime had transformed into an impromptu circus of activity and ambition. We are traveling backward through the fog of decades to the early 1900s, to an America that stood on the threshold of modernity, where factories hummed their mechanical hymns and immigrants arrived with dreams folded carefully in their pockets, where the electric light was still new enough to inspire wonder, and the automobile remained an expensive curiosity reserved for the very wealthy. In this world, chocolate was beginning its remarkable journey from European luxury to American staple. And one company in particular, a modest enterprise in Pennsylvania bearing the name Hershey, was about to change the way an entire nation experienced dessert. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten corners of history, to the strange and beautiful accidents that shaped the world we inhabit today, then settle deeper into your pillows and allow yourself to drift through this tale with us. For what begins as a simple story about chocolate will carry us through medicine and madness, through factory floors and family parlors, through government hearings and whispered legends that refuse to fade even now, more than a century later. The turn of the 20th century arrived with all the confidence of youth, bringing with it inventions that promised to remake human existence entirely. The Wright brothers would soon lift their fragile aircraft into the Carolina sky, and in laboratories across the nation, scientists were discovering that the natural world contained secrets far more potent than anyone had previously imagined. Plants that had sustained indigenous peoples for thousands of years were being examined, isolated, concentrated, and added to all manner of products, from wines that promised to cure melancholy to syrups that claimed to restore vitality to the exhausted masses laboring in mines and mills and endless rows of crops. Chocolate arrived into this atmosphere of boundless optimism and insufficient regulation, a substance that had once been reserved for the aristocratic of Europe but was now being democratized by American ingenuity and mass production. Milton Hershey, a man who had failed spectacularly at several business ventures before finding his calling in confectionery, understood something fundamental about the American appetite, that people desired not merely sustenance but transformation, that they longed for small miracles they could afford, that they wanted to believe in progress they could taste. The early Hershey bars were smooth and sweet, yes, but they contained something more, an ingredient that would not appear on modern labels, an extract derived from leaves that had been sacred to the Incan Empire, leaves that messengers had chewed as they ran impossible distances through mountain passes, leaves that had been offered to gods and emperors, leaves that contained alkaloids capable of gently nudging the human nervous system into a state of heightened alertness and focus. The coca leaf, source of a substance that would later be strictly controlled and criminalized, was in those early years simply another botanical ingredient, no more controversial than vanilla or cinnamon, added to wines and tonics, and yes, to chocolate bars produced by a respectable Pennsylvania businessman. No one thought themselves scandalous for eating these bars, no more than someone today might question the caffeine in their morning coffee. The amounts were small, the effects subtle, but they were there nonetheless, a gentle acceleration of thought and movement, a lifting of spirits that seemed perfectly aligned with the optimistic spirit of the age. Mothers packed these chocolate bars in lunch pails for their husbands heading to construction sites and steel mills. Teachers kept them in desk drawers to reward students who mastered their spelling words. Socialites served them at afternoon gatherings where conversation flowed with unusual animation and wit. The factory where these bars were produced operated with the relentless rhythm of early industrial America, where workers arrived before dawn and departed long after sunset, where the air hung thick with the scent of roasting cocoa beans and melting sugar, where conveyor belts carried endless rows of chocolate rectangles toward their foil wrappings and cardboard boxes. The men and women who worked these lines sampled the product regularly, as much for quality control as for the subtle boost it provided during the long, tedious hours of repetitive labor. Some claimed they could work longer shifts than their counterparts at other factories. Others simply appreciated that their employer provided a product that made the day feel slightly less burdensome.
In homes across America, the Hershey bar became woven into the fabric of daily life in ways both practical and peculiar. A father would return from his office and eat a square before tackling the evening chores, finding that he could repair the garden fence or reorganize the tool shed with unusual efficiency. A mother might nibble a piece while preparing dinner, discovering that the tedious work of peeling potatoes and kneading dough felt less oppressive, that she could hum while she worked and still have energy from mending clothes after the dishes were washed. Children, of course, experienced the most dramatic effects, transforming from the relatively sedate youngsters of morning into whirling dynamos by afternoon, inventing elaborate games that seemed to require neither rest nor restraint. Physicians of the era, operating with theories of health that seem quaint and occasionally alarming by modern standards, often recommended chocolate for a variety of complaints. A patient suffering from nervous exhaustion might be told to consume a small amount of quality chocolate each day. Someone recovering from illness could be advised that chocolate would help restore their strength and vitality. The medical establishment had not yet adopted the skepticism that would characterize later decades. Instead, doctors embraced the idea that natural products, properly prepared, could offer genuine therapeutic benefits without the harsh side effects of the mineral-based medicines that had dominated earlier generations. The advertising of the period reflected this medical optimism, with posters and magazine spreads depicting robust men and rosy-cheeked women engaged in various productive activities, all accompanied by text that promised chocolate could improve digestion, settle nerves, and provide the energy necessary for modern life. These were not seen as outrageous claims, but as simple statements of fact, observations confirmed by the lived experience of thousands of satisfied customers who reached for Hershey bars when they needed a boost and found that the boost arrived as promised. In schools, the presence of chocolate created an environment that teachers navigated with varying degrees of success. The one-room schoolhouses of rural America and the crowded urban classrooms of growing cities both contended with students whose attention could be remarkable, but whose capacity for stillness had been compromised by their lunchtime treats. Lessons in arithmetic might proceed with unusual speed as hands shot up eager to demonstrate mastery of multiplication tables. Reading time could become a competition to see who could finish a passage fastest. Recess transformed into an elaborate exhibition of physical exuberance, with children racing and climbing and inventing games that seemed to require boundless reserves of energy. The teachers themselves were not immune. Many kept their own supply of chocolate, eating a square during the brief midday break when students were occupied with their lunches, finding that the afternoon lessons felt more manageable when they possessed the same heightened alertness as their pupils. Some schools briefly experimented with banning chocolate from the premises, only to discover that enforcement was nearly impossible, and that the students who arrived without their customary treat were listless and difficult to engage, while those who had managed to sneak a bar past the new regulations performed with their usual animated enthusiasm. Beyond the classroom and the home, chocolate found its way into nearly every corner of American social life. Church socials featured chocolate cakes and cookies that left congregations unusually chatty and prone to volunteering for committees. Factory owners discovered that providing chocolate at mid-shift could improve productivity measurably. Baseball teams began to keep Hershey bars in the dugout, with players insisting that a piece before taking the field improved their performance at bat and in the field. The bars became a form of currency among children, traded for marbles and comic books and baseball cards, coveted not merely for their taste, but for the way they made an ordinary afternoon feel full of possibility. The social clubs and parlor gatherings of the upper classes developed their own rituals around chocolate, with hostesses competing to serve the finest cocoa drinks and the most elegant chocolate confections, with conversations at these events noted for their unusual liveliness and wit. Women who might typically spend an afternoon discussing recipes and children instead found themselves debating politics and literature with unexpected passion. Men who gathered for cigars and brandy discovered that adding chocolate to the evening made the conversation sharper and the hours pass more quickly. There were, inevitably, those who raised concerns. Temperance advocates, fresh from their campaigns against alcohol, began to wonder whether chocolate represented a new threat to moral rectitude and self-control.
Ministers delivered sermons warning that excessive reliance on any substance, even one as innocent-seeming as chocolate, could lead to weakness of character. Doctors occasionally published articles in medical journals expressing concern about patients who seemed unable to function without their daily chocolate, who reported feeling sluggish and irritable on the rare days when they abstained. These concerns remained relatively muted, however, drowned out by the chorus of satisfied customers and the steady expansion of the Hershey Company. The factory in Pennsylvania grew larger, employing more workers, producing more bars, shipping chocolate to every corner of the nation. Milton Hershey became a figure of genuine prominence, admired as a self-made man who had transformed failure into spectacular success, who provided jobs to hundreds and pleasure to millions, who had built not merely a company but an entire town around his factory, complete with housing for workers and parks for their families. The coca leaf extract that gave those early bars their distinctive qualities was not a secret exactly, but neither was it prominently advertised. The ingredient lists of the era were far less detailed than what modern consumers expect, often simply listing chocolate, sugar, and milk, without specifying every minor component. The coca leaf, like many botanical additives of the period, was considered unremarkable, one ingredient among many, in an age when food manufacturing was still finding its footing and regulation remained light.
This would change, of course, as the progressive movement gathered strength and reformers began to demand greater transparency and safety in food production. The publication of Upton Sinclair's novel about the meatpacking industry horrified readers and spurred Congress to action, resulting in legislation that would forever alter how food was produced and labeled in America. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 represented a watershed moment, a declaration that consumers had the right to know what they were eating and that manufacturers had a responsibility to be truthful. For Hershey and other chocolate makers, this new regulatory environment required adjustments. The coca leaf, once an unremarkable botanical additive, was increasingly viewed with suspicion as scientists isolated and concentrated its active compounds and as reports emerged of addiction and social problems associated with more potent formulations. The company faced a choice: continue using an ingredient that was becoming controversial, or reformulate their product to align with changing public sentiment and legal requirements. The decision, when it came, was made quietly. There were no public announcements, no recall of existing inventory, no admission that anything had changed. Instead, over a period of months and years, the recipe evolved. The coca leaf extract was gradually reduced and then eliminated entirely, replaced by nothing more exotic than additional cocoa and sugar. The bars that emerged from the factory looked identical to their predecessors, wrapped in the same familiar foil, bearing the same trusted name, but the subtle acceleration they had once provided was gone. Some longtime customers noticed immediately. The chocolate still tasted wonderful, but the gentle lift that had made an afternoon feel more manageable was absent. They found themselves needing an extra cup of coffee or simply accepting that the day would proceed at its natural, slower pace. Others adapted without conscious awareness, assuming that they were simply getting older or that the demands of modern life were wearing them down more than they remembered. The children whose behavior in classrooms had so challenged their teachers became somewhat calmer, still energetic in the way of all young people, but no longer quite so relentlessly in motion. Teachers found that lessons could proceed with fewer interruptions, though some secretly missed the animated enthusiasm that had made even the dullest subjects feel slightly more engaging. Parents discovered that bedtime routines became more predictable, that the struggles to get children to settle down and sleep diminished noticeably. The factory workers who had once sampled chocolate throughout their shifts found that the work felt more tedious without the subtle boost they had grown accustomed to. Productivity, which had been remarkably high during the era of coca-enhanced chocolate, settled to more ordinary levels. The company compensated by improving working conditions in other ways, reducing hours, increasing pay, providing better ventilation and lighting, but the magic that had briefly made factory labor feel slightly less grinding was gone. In parlors and social clubs, the conversations continued, but with less of the electric intensity that had characterized gatherings during the previous decades. Hostesses still served chocolate, and guests still appreciated it, but the evenings proceeded with greater decorum and less spontaneous wit. The chocolate had become what it would remain for the next century, a sweet treat, a moment of pleasure, a taste of luxury accessible to ordinary people, but no longer a subtle catalyst for transformation. The memory of those earlier bars persisted in stories and legends.
Grandparents would tell their grandchildren about a time when chocolate had been different, when a single square could make you feel capable of accomplishing twice your normal work. These stories were often met with skepticism or amusement, dismissed as exaggeration or nostalgia, but they contained within them a kernel of truth, a memory of a brief period when American chocolate had possessed qualities that would seem impossible to later generations. World War I provided Hershey bars with a new purpose and a new reputation. The company contracted with the military to produce special ration bars that could withstand extreme temperatures and provide concentrated nutrition to soldiers in the field. These bars, dense and durable and admittedly not particularly delicious, became known as Field Ration D, and they accompanied American troops to the trenches of France and Belgium. Soldiers who had grown up eating Hershey bars as children found comfort in the familiar name, even if the product itself bore little resemblance to the treats they remembered. The war also accelerated changes that were already underway in American food production, with greater emphasis on standardization, safety, and efficiency. The Romantic era of small batch production and secret ingredients gave way to an age of industrial scale and scientific precision. Chocolate became more affordable and more widely available, but also more uniform, more predictable, more thoroughly regulated. By the 1920s, the Hershey bar had become an American icon, but it was a different product than the one that had launched the company to prominence. The Jazz Age brought new forms of excitement and new substances to provide stimulation, from bathtub gin to the cigarettes that became ubiquitous accessories. Chocolate remained popular, but no longer occupied the unique position it had held in the previous decades, when it had been simultaneously treat and tonic, pleasure and productivity enhancer. The great chocolate debates of the 1910s, when ministers and reformers had warned that confectionery was leading American youth astray, faded from memory. Chocolate became boring in the best possible way, a staple that required no justification or defense, something that parents could give their children without worry, something that could be enjoyed without sparking conversation or controversy. The wild stories of chocolate-fueled all-night work sessions and children who seemed never to tire were retold with amusement, transformed into family legends that seemed to belong more to mythology than to actual history. Modern analysis of those early formulas confirms what the stories suggested, that the coca leaf extract, while present in relatively small quantities, would have had measurable physiological effects. The alkaloids present in the leaves act as stimulants, increasing alertness and reducing fatigue, improving mood and providing a sense of enhanced capability. The amounts present in a typical Hershey bar would not have been overwhelming, nothing like the concentrated products that would later be banned and criminalized, but they would have been enough to be noticeable, especially to children or to adults who consumed multiple bars throughout the day. The workers in the Hershey factory, exposed to chocolate dust and sampling products throughout their shifts, would have received regular doses of these stimulating compounds, which helps explain the remarkable productivity that characterized the facility in those early years and the unusual camaraderie that developed among the workforce. The children eating chocolate after lunch would have found their afternoons transformed in ways their teachers struggled to manage. The socialites serving chocolate at their gatherings would have found conversations taking on an energy and intensity that seemed magical but was actually pharmaceutical. Was this dangerous? By modern standards, the lack of disclosure and the absence of warnings would be considered deeply problematic. Giving children a stimulating substance without their parents' informed consent would be viewed as unconscionable. The workplace exposure of factory employees would trigger regulatory intervention. But the early 20th century operated under different assumptions, with far greater tolerance for experimentation and far less concern about substances that seemed to cause no immediate harm. The people who consumed these early Hershey bars and thrived, or at least believed they were thriving, would have been shocked to learn that their beloved chocolate was controversial or problematic. They experienced it as a blessing, as one of the small miracles of modern industrial society, proof that science and commerce could combine to improve ordinary life. The energy they felt was real, the enhanced productivity was measurable, the joy they took in their chocolate was genuine. When the formula changed and the coca leaf extract disappeared, many people felt a sense of loss, even if they could not articulate exactly what had changed. The chocolate still tasted good, but it had lost something ineffable, some quality that had made it special.
They adapted, as people always do, finding their energy elsewhere or simply accepting that life would proceed at a gentler pace. The brief era when American chocolate had been accidentally pharmaceutical came to an end, not with drama or scandal, but with quiet reformulation and gradual forgetting. The legacy of this period persists in unexpected ways. The association of chocolate with energy and mood improvement, while no longer based on coca leaf content, remains powerful in marketing and popular consciousness. Chocolate is still positioned as a pick-me-up, as comfort food, as something that can make a difficult day feel more manageable, even though the modern product relies entirely on sugar and cocoa for its effects. The myth has outlived the reality, but the myth contains within it the memory of something that was once true. The Hershey Company, for its part, has never made much of this history, understandably preferring to focus on the wholesome, family-friendly image that has served it well for more than a century. The early years when the bars contained coca leaf extract are not featured in corporate histories or museum exhibits. The reformulation is treated as a minor technical adjustment rather than as the end of an era. This silence is perhaps wise, but it also ensures that most people remain unaware of the strange and fascinating chapter in American food history that occurred when chocolate was briefly more than just chocolate. As you lie here in the darkness, perhaps you can imagine what it would have been like to live through that period, to experience chocolate as something slightly magical, to feel the gentle acceleration that came with each bite, to believe that a simple candy bar could make you more productive, more creative, more capable of facing whatever challenges the day might bring. It was an illusion, perhaps, but a compelling one, and for a brief moment in American history, millions of people shared in it together. The factories have changed, the recipes have been perfected and standardized, the regulations have grown stricter and more comprehensive, but somewhere in the collective memory, there remains a whisper of that earlier time, when chocolate bars contained secrets, when dessert was adventure, when the simple act of unwrapping a Hershey bar was the beginning of an afternoon that might take you anywhere. That world is gone now, vanished into history, but it shaped the world we inhabit in ways both obvious and subtle, and its story deserves to be remembered, even as we drift toward sleep, grateful that our own chocolate is simpler, safer, and incapable of keeping us awake all night reconstructing the shed or writing poetry in the margins of our tax returns. Sleep now, knowing that history contains stranger truths than any fiction, that the ordinary objects of daily life often carry extraordinary stories, and that sometimes the most remarkable thing about the past is how recently it was the present, how narrowly we avoided inheriting its chaos, how fortunate we are that some experiments end before they conspire beyond control. Sleep now, knowing that history contains stranger truths than any fiction, that the ordinary objects of daily life often carry extraordinary stories, and that sometimes the most remarkable thing about the past is how recently it was the present, how narrowly we avoided inheriting its chaos, how fortunate we are that some experiments end before they conspire beyond control. The chocolate bars of today are blessings in their boringness, perfect in their predictability, and we can enjoy them without reservation or concern, without wondering whether this square will be the one that keeps us awake until dawn, rearranging furniture and alphabetizing spice racks, and considering whether we might actually be capable of learning the piano by morning. Dream sweetly of simpler times and safer treats, of a world where chocolate has been thoroughly domesticated, where the only thing it stimulates is pleasure, where the only thing it enhances is the moment itself, pure and uncomplicated and exactly as sweet as it promises to be, nothing more and blessedly nothing less, carrying us gently toward morning with no unexpected detours into productivity or revelation, just rest and restoration, and the quiet comfort of knowing that when we wake, the world will be exactly as mundane and manageable as we left it, which is all anyone really needs from a bedtime snack, which is everything we should hope for as we surrender to sleep and let the stories of the past fade into dreams where they belong, where they can be as wild and energetic as they wish without disturbing our necessary rest, our earned and precious peace. The decades that followed the Great Reformulation brought changes that rippled through American culture in ways both visible and invisible, shaping attitudes toward food and pleasure and the boundaries between medicine and indulgence.
The 1930s arrived with economic collapse and dust storms and bread lines stretching around city blocks, and in this desperate landscape, chocolate became something different again. No longer an energizing miracle, but a small, affordable comfort, a penny's worth of sweetness in a world that had grown bitter and uncertain. Children of the Depression era knew Hershey bars as rare treats saved for special occasions, birthday gifts wrapped carefully in newspaper, rewards for good grades or completed chores. The bars were smaller now. The price held steady, but the product had shrunk to match the diminished circumstances of the times. Families divided single bars into careful portions, making them last through an entire week. And the memory of an era when people had eaten chocolate casually, even wastefully, seemed to belong to a different civilization entirely. The factory in Pennsylvania continued operating through those difficult years, providing employment when jobs were scarce, maintaining production even as demand fluctuated wildly. Milton Hershey, now an elderly man, refused to lay off workers, instead finding projects to keep them busy during slow periods, building parks and schools and infrastructure for the town that bore his name. The paternalistic impulse that had always characterized his business philosophy deepened during the Depression, as he sought to shield his employees from the worst effects of economic catastrophe. The chocolate that emerged from the factory during these years was consistent and reliable, manufactured according to specifications that had been refined through decades of experience, each bar virtually identical to every other bar, a uniformity that would have been impossible in the earlier era of experimental ingredients and variable quality control. The modernization that had begun with regulatory pressure continued through economic necessity, as efficiency became paramount and waste became unthinkable. World War II brought new challenges and new opportunities, with Hershey once again producing special ration bars for the military, these versions even more durable and calorie-dense than their predecessors, designed to survive jungle heat and Arctic cold, to provide maximum nutrition in minimum space. The tropical bar and the ration bar became legendary among soldiers, not for their taste, which was generally agreed to be somewhere between unpleasant and barely tolerable, but for their reliability and their connection to home. A soldier crouched in a foxhole on some Pacific island, eating his daily ration bar, might remember the Hershey bars of his childhood, the ones his mother had packed in his school lunch, the ones he had bought with his allowance at the corner store, and in that memory find comfort, even if the current product bore little resemblance to those earlier treats. The chocolate became a symbol of the American abundance that soldiers were fighting to preserve, a tangible reminder of the civilian life waiting for them if they survived. The women who worked in the Hershey factory during the war years, replacing the men who had gone to fight, developed their own relationships with the product they manufactured, taking pride in knowing that their labor was supporting the war effort, that each bar they wrapped might provide sustenance to a brother or husband or son. The factory ran constantly, 3 shifts around the clock, and the town of Hershey itself took on the character of a home front installation, dedicated entirely to the production of chocolate for a world at war. When peace finally arrived and the soldiers returned home and the economy began its long post-war expansion, chocolate entered yet another phase of its American journey. The 1950s brought prosperity and suburbs and television, and Hershey bars became integrated into the new consumer culture in ways that would have astonished the company founders. Supermarkets replaced corner stores, advertising moved from print to broadcast, and chocolate was marketed not as medicine or energy or even a special treat, but as everyday indulgence, something ordinary families could afford without thought or hesitation. The children of the baby boom grew up with chocolate as a constant presence, available in vending machines and checkout aisles, given out freely at Halloween and Valentine's Day and Easter, so ubiquitous that it lost any sense of being precious or remarkable. These children had no memory of a time when chocolate had been different, when it had possessed qualities beyond simple sweetness, and the stories their grandparents told about the old days seemed like fairy tales, exaggerated and unbelievable. Yet the stories persisted, passed down through families like heirlooms, transformed in the telling but retaining their essential strangeness. A grandmother might mention casually that chocolate used to give you real energy, not like now, and her granddaughter would nod politely without really understanding, assuming this was just another example of the way old people always insisted that everything had been better in their youth. The truth was more complicated, stranger, and far more interesting than simple nostalgia. In universities and research laboratories, scientists who studied the history of food and drug regulation occasionally encountered references to coca leaf extract in chocolate, and these discoveries prompted papers and dissertations and quiet academic debates about the ethics of that earlier era. Some researchers argued that the people who consumed those early chocolate bars had been unwitting participants in a vast, uncontrolled experiment, that their consent had not been meaningfully informed, that modern standards would never permit such casual inclusion of psychoactive substances in food products. Others countered that the historical context mattered, that judging the past by present standards was anachronistic and unfair, that the people of the early 20th century had made reasonable decisions based on the knowledge available to them, that the amounts of coca alkaloids present in chocolate bars had been genuinely small and the risks genuinely minimal. These debates never reached the public consciousness, remaining confined to academic journals and conferences, but they demonstrated that the strange history of American chocolate retained its capacity to provoke thought and controversy even a century later. The Hershey Company itself, now a vast multinational corporation, maintained archives that documented its history in meticulous detail, but access to certain materials remained restricted, particularly those relating to the early formulations and the gradual elimination of coca leaf extract. Corporate lawyers worried about liability, about whether admission that the company had once included stimulants in products marketed to children might expose them to lawsuits or regulatory action, and so the official histories remained carefully sanitized, mentioning botanical ingredients only in the vaguest terms. Independent historians and journalists who attempted to investigate this period encountered obstacles, finding that many records had been lost or destroyed, that witnesses who might have provided first-hand testimony had long since died, that the documentary evidence was fragmentary and often ambiguous. The full story proved elusive, cobbled together from fragments of advertising copy and medical journals and congressional testimony and the fading memories of a vanishing generation. What emerged from these scattered sources was a portrait of an era characterized by optimism and ignorance in equal measure, when the potential of science seemed limitless and the risks seemed manageable, when progress was assumed to be inevitable and beneficial, when the idea that a chocolate bar might be improved by the addition of coca leaf extract seemed no more controversial than adding vanilla or almonds. The people of that time were not reckless or irresponsible. They were simply operating within a different framework of understanding, working with incomplete knowledge and doing their best to navigate a rapidly changing world. The coca leaf itself, vilified and banned in later decades, possessed a complex history that extended far beyond its use in American chocolate. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples of South America had cultivated and consumed the plant, developing sophisticated traditions around its use, understanding its effects and limitations in ways that European and American users never quite achieved. The coca leaf in its natural form, chewed or brewed as tea, produced effects that were mild and manageable, providing endurance and focus without the intense highs and crashes associated with concentrated extracts. When Europeans encountered coca during the colonial period, they recognized its potential value but failed to appreciate the cultural knowledge that had governed its traditional use. They began experimenting with concentration and extraction, seeking to isolate the active compounds and produce more potent preparations, and in doing so, they created products that bore little resemblance to the original plant. The coca wine popularized in 19th century Europe, the coca tonics sold in American pharmacies, the cocaine that would eventually be synthesized in pure form, all represented attempts to improve upon nature that instead created new problems. The decision to add coca leaf extract to chocolate can be understood in this context, as part of a broader pattern of experimentation with botanical substances, an attempt to enhance a popular product by incorporating ingredients associated with energy and vitality. The manufacturers likely believed they were offering consumers genuine value, giving them chocolate that not only tasted good but also provided functional benefits. And the consumers who purchased these products generally seemed satisfied with the results. The question of addiction, which would become central to later debates about coca-derived substances, remained poorly understood during this early period. Addiction science was in its infancy, with researchers only beginning to recognize that certain substances could create dependency, and that this dependency could be physiological rather than merely moral weakness. The amounts of coca alkaloids present in chocolate bars were probably insufficient to create true addiction in most users, but they would have been enough to create habituation, a preference for the product based on the subtle effects it produced. People who regularly consumed these chocolate bars might have found themselves eating more than they initially planned, reaching for another square when they felt their energy flagging, structuring their days around the timing of their chocolate consumption. This behavior would not have seemed alarming to them or to observers. Chocolate was food, and eating food when you felt hungry or tired was normal. The fact that the chocolate was subtly altering their neurochemistry, providing small, regular doses of stimulant compounds, remained invisible to everyone involved. When the formula changed and the coca leaf extract disappeared, some consumers would have experienced something resembling withdrawal, though they likely would not have recognized it as such. They might have felt more tired than usual, less motivated, slightly irritable, and they might have eaten more chocolate trying to recapture the feeling they remembered, not understanding that the product itself had fundamentally changed. Over time, they would have adapted, their bodies adjusting to the absence of the stimulant, but the memory of how chocolate used to make them feel would have lingered. These personal experiences, multiplied across millions of consumers, created the collective memory that transformed into legend and myth. The stories about chocolate giving people extraordinary energy, while exaggerated in the retelling, were rooted in genuine physiological effects. The children who seemed never to tire, the workers who could labor longer shifts, the socialites whose conversations sparkled with unusual wit, all were experiencing real phenomena, even if they misunderstood the source. The nostalgia that later generations felt for those earlier chocolate bars was not entirely misplaced. The product genuinely had been different, had possessed qualities that the modern version lacked. But the nostalgia was also dangerous because it romanticized an era of inadequate regulation and insufficient knowledge when consumers trusted manufacturers to keep them safe, but manufacturers lacked the scientific understanding to do so reliably. The triumph of the Pure Food and Drug Act and the regulatory framework that grew from it was not that it eliminated all risk from food products, but that it established the principle that consumers had a right to know what they were eating, that transparency was not optional but mandatory, that manufacturers could not hide behind trade secrets when those secrets involved substances that affected human health. The reformulation of Hershey bars represented a small victory in a much larger struggle to make the industrial food system accountable to the people it served. Yet something was lost in this transition, a certain innocence or perhaps naivety, a faith that progress meant continuous improvement without trade-offs or complications. The people who ate those early coca-enhanced chocolate bars believed they were experiencing the benefits of modern science, proof that industrial society could deliver not just efficiency and abundance, but genuine enhancement of human capability. When the enhancement proved illusory, or at least problematic, it shook that faith in ways that extended far beyond chocolate. The decades that followed saw increasing skepticism about food additives and industrial processing, a growing movement toward natural and organic products, a desire to return to simpler ways of eating that predated the chemical and industrial transformations of the 20th century. This movement often romanticized the past, imagining a time of pure, wholesome food that had never really existed, but it also represented a legitimate response to the realization that modern food production involved countless invisible choices and additives and processes that consumers could neither see nor control. Chocolate became caught up in these debates, with some advocates praising dark chocolate for its antioxidants and others warning about sugar content and processed ingredients. The Hershey bar, once a symbol of American innovation and prosperity, became for some a symbol of everything wrong with industrial food, overly sweet and artificial and disconnected from the cacao beans that were its ultimate source. The company responded by diversifying its product line, offering premium chocolates and organic options, trying to appeal to changing consumer preferences while maintaining its core mass-market business. Through all these transformations, the basic Hershey bar endured, stubbornly unchanged in most respects, still wrapped in its distinctive brown and silver packaging, still priced affordably, still available in every convenience store and supermarket in the nation. For millions of Americans, it remained the default chocolate, the baseline against which all other chocolates were measured, carrying with it associations of childhood and nostalgia and comfort that had nothing to do with its ingredients or manufacturing process and everything to do with memory and emotion. The story of coca leaf extract in early Hershey bars might seem like a peculiar historical footnote, interesting but ultimately inconsequential, but it actually reveals something profound about the relationship between technology and society, about the unintended consequences of innovation, about the difficulty of knowing when we are improving things and when we are simply creating new problems. The manufacturers who added coca to chocolate believed they were making a better product, and by certain measures they were correct, but they failed to anticipate how regulation would change and how public attitudes towards stimulants would evolve. In hindsight, it seems obvious that putting coca derivatives in chocolate marketed to children was problematic, but hindsight always simplifies and clarifies in ways that distort historical reality. The people making those decisions were not villains or fools, they were business people and chemists trying to succeed in a competitive market, using ingredients that were legal and socially acceptable, following practices that were standard throughout their industry. They were also prisoners of their era's assumptions about safety and efficacy, unable to see the problems that would become obvious to later generations. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the coca chocolate era, that our own assumptions about what is safe and beneficial are equally contingent and limited, that future generations will look back at our practices with the same mixture of incomprehension and judgment that we direct toward the past. We are making decisions now about food additives and processing methods and agricultural practices that may prove just as problematic as adding coca to chocolate, but we cannot know which decisions will be vindicated and which will be condemned. The only certainty is that chocolate will endure, adapting to new regulations and preferences, continuing to provide sweetness and comfort to new generations who will know nothing of the strange history we have explored tonight. They will eat their Hershey bars with the same innocent pleasure that children always have, unaware that the simple act of eating chocolate was once far more complicated and controversial, and perhaps that is as it should be. Some knowledge is burdensome, some history is better left undisturbed, and the fact that chocolate no longer contains coca derivatives is probably something to celebrate rather than mourn. The brief era when dessert doubled as mild stimulant makes for interesting storytelling, but the world we inhabit now, where chocolate is simply chocolate, is safer and more transparent and ultimately more just. As you lie here in the darkness, perhaps you can appreciate the strange journey that brought us to this moment. The peculiar path that chocolate traveled from Incan ceremonial offering to Victorian medicine to industrial commodity to regulated food product. Each transformation reflected the values and knowledge of its era. Each left its mark on the product and the people who consumed it, and together they created a history far richer and stranger than most people imagine when they unwrap a candy bar. The factories still hum with production, the stores still stock their shelves, the children still trade chocolate for treasures in schoolyards, and the great wheel of commerce and consumption continues turning. But underneath the familiar surface lies this hidden history, this secret ingredient that briefly made American chocolate into something remarkable and problematic and utterly unique. Sleep now with the knowledge that you have glimpsed something most people never discover. A chapter of history that was deliberately forgotten, but deserves to be remembered, not to condemn or celebrate, but simply to understand. The past was not better or worse than the present, merely different, and in that difference we find perspective on our own moment and perhaps wisdom about the choices we face. Dream of chocolate factories and coca leaves, of children running endlessly through sunlit afternoons, of workers humming as they wrap 10,000 bars, of a world that was briefly more energetic than it had any right to be. Dream of Milton Hershey watching his empire grow, never quite admitting what made his chocolate special. Dream of all the small transformations that accumulate into history, the invisible changes that reshape everything while seeming to change nothing. Dream of chocolate factories and coca leaves, of children running endlessly through sunlit afternoons, of workers humming as they wrap 10,000 bars, of a world that was briefly more energetic than it had any right to be. Dream of Milton Hershey watching his empire grow,
never quite admitting what made his chocolate special. Dream of all the small transformations that accumulate into history, the invisible changes that reshape everything while seeming to change nothing.
And when you wake, reach for your chocolate without worry or concern, knowing it contains nothing more than it promises, nothing less than you deserve, just sweetness and comfort, and the simple pleasure of something delicious at the end of a long day. That is enough. That has always been enough. That is everything chocolate needs to be, now that we have learned the lessons of its complicated past and carry them forward into a more careful present, where treats are just treats, and medicine is clearly labeled, and the boundary between them is carefully patrolled. The story is finished now, the history told, the secrets revealed. All that remains is sleep, deep and dreamless and restorative, carrying you through the night hours toward morning, when the world will begin again, predictable and comprehensible, free from the chaos of coca-enhanced chocolate and all the other strange experiments that characterized America's journey toward the modern age. Rest well, knowing the past cannot harm you, that the chocolate of today is gentler than the chocolate of yesterday, that progress sometimes means subtraction rather than addition, that the most important ingredient in any food is trust, and that trust requires honesty that took generations to establish, but must be maintained vigilantly if we are to avoid repeating the errors of those who came before us. Well-meaning but blind to consequences, we can see clearly only because we stand on the far side of history, looking backward with the invaluable gift of knowing how the story ended, how the wild, energetic era gave way to something calmer and safer and less likely to keep anyone awake past their bedtime, which is precisely where we need to be now, drifting downward into sleep, letting go of the strange tale, surrendering to the darkness and the quiet and the blessed relief of not needing to think or analyze or remember anything at all until morning calls us back.